On a hot afternoon in October 2023, amateur fishermen at the Barra Bonita Reservoir in the interior of São Paulo made a discovery that reopened a mystery forgotten for nearly 70 years. Just 6 meters underwater, covered by decades of silt and aquatic vegetation, lay a sky blue 1954 DKW-Vemag. But what truly sent chills down the spines of those men was what was still clutched to the steering wheel of that car. Before we continue with the story that defies time and logic, I need you to do something for me. If you're enjoying this content, leave a like now. It helps the channel grow and motivates me to bring more intriguing cases like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell because you won't want to miss what we uncovered about this case. I promise that by the end of this video, you'll understand why this disappearance remained hidden for so long and what the discovery of this car revealed about one of the most mysterious nights in the history of São Paulo. The year was 1954. Brazil was living the golden years of the Juscelino Kubitschek era, and the interior of São Paulo thrived with coffee and sugarcane farms. In João, a city 295 kilometers from the capital, with just over 30,000 inhabitants at the time, everyone knew Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa, tall at 1.83 meters, with black hair always slicked with brilliantine, a neatly trimmed thin mustache, and penetrating brown eyes. Osvaldo was impossible to miss. At 42, he owned the Santa Eulalia farm, a 250 acre property stretching along what was then just the Teat River before the construction of the Barra Bonita Reservoir. Osvaldo wasn't just a prosperous farmer. He was a man of meticulous, almost obsessive habits. He woke every day at 5 a.m., drank his black coffee without sugar, read the João newspaper cover to cover, and only then began his rounds around the property. His wife, Carmela Ferreira da Costa, was a delicate 28-year-old woman with wavy blonde hair, always tied in an elegant bun. They had 2 children, Osvaldo Jr., just 6 years old, and little Helena, 4. The family lived in a large masonry house with wide verandas and Portuguese tiles, considered one of the most beautiful in the region. What few knew was that Osvaldo had a special pride. His sky blue DKW-Vemag, chassis number 3241, was one of the first models manufactured in Brazil, and he had purchased it in February of that year directly from a São Paulo dealership. The car had genuine leather seats, a polished wood dashboard, and that unmistakable new car scent that Osvaldo adored. He personally washed it every Saturday morning, and woe to anyone who touched it without his permission. Osvaldo was known for his infuriating punctuality. If he said he would arrive at 3 p.m., he arrived at 3 p.m. Not 3:05, not 2:55 to 3 p.m. sharp. This trait would make his disappearance even more incomprehensible. He was also a man of his word. In business, a handshake with Osvaldo was worth more than any written contract. The farm workers respected him, though they saw him as a strict, demanding boss who tolerated no sloppiness. But there was another side of Osvaldo that his wife knew well. He was a loving father who, despite his rigid approach to business, melted completely when Osvaldo Jr. and Helena ran to embrace him at the end of the day. He had a habit of bringing small gifts from town, a candy, a simple toy, a flower for Carmela. These small gestures revealed a man far more complex than the stern exterior he showed to the world. The night of August 23, 1954, began like any other Monday at Santa Eulalia Farm. The day had been typical of winter in the interior of São Paulo. Dry around 18 degrees Celsius, clear skies, and that cold wind blowing from the south as evening approached. Osvaldo had spent the day supervising the planting of a new area of the property, working side by side with his laborers from 6 a.m. At 5:45 p.m., he entered the house, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, kissed Carmela on the forehead, and announced he needed to go to Zhao to handle a matter at the notary. He said he would return by 8 p.m., at the latest 9, for dinner. Carmela didn't find it strange. It was common for Osvaldo to make these quick trips to town to deal with farm-related bureaucracy. He changed clothes, putting on gray dress pants, a long-sleeved white shirt, and his brown wool overcoat, even though it wasn't that cold. He laced up his black leather shoes, always impeccably polished, grabbed his leather wallet, a pack of Continental cigarettes, and the keys to the DKW. Before leaving, he quickly visited the children's room. Osvaldo Jr. was playing with his lead soldiers on the floor, and Helena was drawing in a notebook. He tousled his son's hair and kissed his daughter on the head. At 6:10 p.m., Osvaldo started the DKW's engine. The characteristic roar of the two-stroke motor echoed across the property. 3 workers still in the farmyard saw him leave through the main gate, giving a brief wave. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky orange and red. They would be the last people to see him alive. The dirt road connecting Santa Eulalia Farm to downtown Zhao was approximately 18 kilometers long. It was relatively good for the standards of the time, lined with eucalyptus trees, with some sharp curves near the banks of the Teat River. Osvaldo knew every meter of that route. He had traveled it hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. What no one knew was that Osvaldo would never reach Zhao that night, and the silence that began in the hours that followed would last for 69 years. By 9:30 p.m., Carmela began to worry. It was not like Osvaldo to be late. At 10 p.m., she asked Joaquim, the farm foreman, to go to the homes of some acquaintances in town to see if there was any news. Joaquim returned at 11 p.m. with information that made Carmela's heart race. No one had seen Osvaldo in Zhao that night. The notary office, of course, had been closed since 6 p.m. The businesses along the main street had no record of his presence, and no friends or relatives had received a visit. Osvaldo had simply disappeared somewhere between Santa Eulalia Farm and the city of Zhao on an 18-kilometer route. He could have driven with his eyes closed. Carmela didn't sleep that night. Sitting on the veranda, wrapped in a shawl, she watched the dirt road, hoping to see the DKW's headlights appear in the darkness. But only silence and the cold night answered her vigil. At 6 a.m. on Tuesday, August 24th, she made the decision to call the police. The following day brought a mobilization that Zhao had never seen. The civil police of the city, under the command of Chief Antonio Morera Pinto, a 53-year-old man experienced in solving cases in the region, immediately began the search. But there was a problem. In 1954, resources were extremely limited. There were no helicopters, security cameras, cell phones, or any modern tracking technology. What they had were men, horses, and the old technique of combing every meter. Chief Morera Pinto divided the road between the farm and the city into sectors. Each sector would be inspected by a team composed of police officers and community volunteers. There were about 40 men in total, including neighboring farmers, rural workers, and city merchants who knew and respected Osvaldo. The first theory was the most obvious, an accident. Perhaps Osvaldo had lost control of the vehicle on a curve, especially near the river. But when the team searched those areas, they found no skid marks, no metal fragments, no broken glass, no evidence that a car had left the road. The second theory was darker, robbery followed by murder. The interior of Sao Paulo, though relatively peaceful, had its criminals, groups that robbed farmers, stole cattle, and invaded properties. Osvaldo was known to carry some money, and the DKW was a valuable car. But this theory also faced problems. There were no reports of criminal activity in the area that night. No other farmer had been approached, And why had they not found the body, or at least the abandoned car? Osvaldo's family was devastated. Carmela barely got out of bed. Her sister Lucinda came from Bachacatu to help care for the children. Osvaldo Jr., only 6 years old, did not fully understand what was happening. He asked every day when his father would return, each question piercing Carmela's heart. Little Helena cried, asking for her father at bedtime. Osvaldo's parents, who lived on a small farm near Jao, aged years in just a few days. His father, Bernardino Ferreira da Costa, a strong 67-year-old man who had settled the land decades earlier, rode his horse every day, combing the region for any sign of his son. His mother, Dona Amelia, lit candles at Jao's main church, praying to every saint she knew. The newspapers of the time, especially the Correo de Jao and some São Paulo periodicals, covered the disappearance. Headlines ranged from prosperous farmer disappears mysteriously to blue DKW vanishes with owner on the road. But without a body, proof, or witnesses, the story began to fade from the press after 2 weeks. Chief Moreira Pinto worked tirelessly on the case for 3 months. He interrogated all the workers at Santa Eulalia Farm, visited neighboring farms, checked the records of all butcher shops and warehouses in Jao and nearby towns, looking for any suspicious movement of money. Nothing. It was as if Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa and his DKW-Vemag had been swallowed by the earth. However, there was one detail that deeply troubled the chief, a small, almost insignificant detail that would not leave his mind. On the day after the disappearance, a fisherman named Valdemiro Augusto reported having heard, around 7 p.m. on August 23rd, a strange noise coming from the direction of the river near an area about 10 kilometers from Santa Eulalia Farm. He described it as a loud splash, followed by silence. Valdemiro had been fishing for dourados at a curve of the Teat when he heard the sound. At the time, he didn't think much of it, assuming it might have been a large animal falling into the water, perhaps a capybara or a caiman. But when he learned of Osvaldo's disappearance, the memory of that sound haunted him. He reported it to the police. Chief Moreira Pinto took the information seriously. He organized a search operation focused on that specific area of the river. Improvised divers, workers who knew how to swim well, were recruited. They dived dozens of times that week in September, but the Teat was murky with a strong current and varying depths. Underwater visibility was practically zero. After 5 days of fruitless attempts and without proper equipment, the aquatic search was suspended. Months turned into years. 1955 came, then 1956, 1957. Life went on as it always does, even when we wish it wouldn't. Carmela never remarried. She took over the administration of Santa Eulalia Farm with fierce determination, as if keeping the property running were a way of keeping Osvaldo alive in some form. The children grew up without their father, carrying the absence like a wound that never fully healed. Osvaldo Jr. became a lawyer, graduating from the University of São Paulo in 1970. He dedicated part of his career to trying to uncover what had happened to his father, hiring private investigators over the years. Every lead ended in a dead end. Helena married an engineer and moved to Campinas, but never forgot that last moment when her father kissed her on the head before leaving. In the city of Jao, Osvaldo's disappearance became an urban legend. Some said he had run off with a lover to Argentina. Others whispered he owed money to dangerous people and had been executed, his body buried in some sugarcane field. Some even suggested he had led a double life and simply chosen the other one. But those who truly knew Osvaldo knew none of it made sense. Carmela died in 1992 at 66, never knowing what had happened to her husband. Until the end, She kept the master bedroom exactly as Osvaldo had left it on the night of August 23, 1954. His clothes in the wardrobe, his polished shoes by the bed, his hairbrush with a few black hairs still caught in the bristles. Osvaldo Jr. inherited the farm, but did not share his father's love for the land. In 1998, he sold the property to a company cultivating sugarcane. It was a painful farewell to a piece of family history, but he could no longer walk those lands without seeing his father's ghost in every corner. Then something happened that would change everything. In 1963, 9 years after Osvaldo's disappearance, the federal government began construction of the Barra Bonita hydroelectric plant. The project was ambitious, damming the Teat River to generate electricity and enable river navigation. The work was completed in 1964, creating a massive reservoir. The Barra Bonita Dam flooded thousands of hectares of land, including large stretches of the old road connecting Santa Eulalia Farm to Jao. Houses were submerged, trees disappeared under the water, and the landscape was completely transformed. With this change, any physical evidence of Osvaldo's fate was covered by meters of water. The family never imagined that the answer to the mystery lay below, preserved by silt and water, patiently waiting for almost 70 years. On October 12, 2023, a group of 3 amateur divers was practicing underwater fishing at the Barra Bonita Reservoir. Marcelo Alves Costa, 37, a certified diving instructor, was accompanied by Bruno Enrique Santos, 32, and Rafael Campos Lima, 29. They had chosen a relatively unexplored area of the reservoir near what used to be the banks of the old rural road. The day was clear, the temperature a pleasant 28 degrees Celsius, and underwater visibility was better than usual due to the lack of rain in previous weeks. Around 2:30 p.m., Marcelo dove to inspect an interesting rock formation that had appeared on his sonar. The depth there was about 6 meters. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just another structure covered in aquatic vegetation and silt, something common on the reservoir floor. But as he approached, his heart nearly stopped. It was a car, an old vehicle almost completely buried under decades of sediment, but unmistakably a car. Marcelo signaled to his companions, and all 3 descended together. Using gloved hands, they carefully began to remove the silt covering the vehicle. Beneath the layer of dirt, a color began to emerge, sky blue. Then they saw the distinctive front grille of an old model. It was a DKW-Vemag, but what made them surface quickly, gasping and in shock, was what was inside the car. Through the foggy, algae-covered windshield, they could make out a silhouette, still strapped to the steering wheel, with a rudimentary seatbelt from the era were human remains. The police were immediately notified. The area was cordoned off. The Jao Civil Police, now equipped with technology far more advanced than in 1954, mobilized specialized teams. Divers from the fire department descended to make an initial assessment. Forensic police were called to coordinate the removal of the vehicle and the remains. The rescue operation took 2 days. A special crane was brought, and on the morning of October 14, 2023, under the eyes of dozens of onlookers, reporters, and families of missing persons in the region over the decades, the sky blue DKW-Vemag was slowly lifted from the dark reservoir waters. The sight was at once fascinating and macabre. The car was remarkably intact, despite being completely covered in silt, algae, and barnacles. Its wheels had sunk into the sediment. The headlights were coated in a thick layer of calcification, but the structure had been preserved like a submerged time capsule. When they opened the driver's door, the trapped water began to drain carefully. They're still strapped to the steering wheel with a handmade seatbelt, probably installed by himself, were the skeletal remains of man. The skeleton was nearly complete. Fragments of clothing fabric remained. Pieces of a brown overcoat, remnants of a once white shirt and leather shoes, surprisingly preserved by the lack of oxygen at the bottom of the reservoir. The forensic investigation was meticulous. Criminal expert Rodrigo Mendez Torres, a specialist in forensic analysis, led the team. Several objects were found inside the vehicle: a deteriorated leather wallet, but with documents still partially legible, a completely disintegrated pack of Continental cigarettes, though the metal wrapper was still identifiable, and most importantly, a driver's license. When cleaned and read, the document confirmed what many had suspected: Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa. Date of birth: March 15, 1912. Address: Santa Eulalia Farm, Rural Jau. The vehicle chassis was verified: 3241. It was exactly the DKW-Vemag that had disappeared on the night of August 23, 1954. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed crucial details. The skeleton was consistent with a man in his early 40s, about 1.80 meters tall. There were no signs of head trauma, stab wounds, or there were no fractures indicating violence. The position of the body, still secured by the seatbelt, suggested that the person had been conscious and trying to control the vehicle at the moment it submerged. The car's mechanical analysis revealed even more. The engine was in neutral. The brakes were engaged, though completely corroded. And here, a picture began to emerge of what probably happened that August night in 1954. Mechanical expert Fabio Augusto Perez, a specialist in vintage vehicles, was called to examine the DKW. His conclusion was revealing. The steering system had a catastrophic failure. The steering column had a rupture point exactly where it connected to the front wheel mechanism, a manufacturing defect that would only be discovered and corrected by Vemag years later, but which had already caused a few documented accidents in 1954 and 1955. The theory that emerged from the investigation was devastating in its tragic simplicity. Osvaldo had been driving along the road, likely at a moderate speed of around 50 kilometers per hour, when he reached one of the curves near the river. At that moment, the steering column failed. The wheel simply lost connection with the front wheels. Osvaldo had perhaps 3 seconds to react before the car left the narrow dirt road and plunged directly into the Teat River. The distance between the road and the riverbank at that point was only about 3 meters with a steep slope. The DKW would have fallen almost vertically into the water, sinking rapidly due to the weight of the front engine. The Teat S current, stronger at that time of year, would have carried the car into deeper waters, far from the bank, into an area impossible to see from the surface. Osvaldo probably tried to open the door, but the water pressure made it impossible. The DKW's windows were not electric, of course, but the crank type likely jammed on impact. Trapped inside, with water rushing in, Osvaldo would have had only a few minutes before losing consciousness. It was a solitary, terrifying, and likely quick death. The splash that fisherman Valdemiro heard at 7 p.m. was almost certainly the sound of the DKW hitting the water. The location matched perfectly, but in 1954, without proper diving equipment, sonar, or modern technology, finding a car in a murky, deep river was impossible. 9 years later, when technology had improved, the dam had already submerged everything. Osvaldo Jr., who was 75 in 2023, was called to identify the personal items found in the car. It was a devastating moment. He held his father's leather wallet, now stiff and stained, and began to cry. 69 years of waiting for answers, and they had finally arrived. But they did not bring the relief he had imagined, only the confirmation of an absurd and avoidable tragedy. Helena, 73, watched the press conference from her home in Campinas. She told reporters, "All my life, I wondered if my father had abandoned us, if he didn't love us enough. Now I know he was coming home. He was always coming home." DNA analysis definitively confirmed the remains were Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa. He was buried in the Jau Municipal Cemetery in a ceremony that brought together descendants, curious onlookers, and people who hadn't even been born when he disappeared, but felt connected to the story. The discovery raised new questions. Why hadn't the original searches found the car? Investigators in 2023 believe the answer lies in geography. The curve where Osvaldo left the road directed the car away from a bank. In 1954, searches were likely conducted very close to the shore, not imagining the vehicle could have been swept into deeper, more distant water. Luck, or lack thereof, also played a role. If Valdemiro had pinpointed the sound more accurately, perhaps they would have found the car. If the underwater searches had lasted one more week, maybe one of the improvised divers would have stumbled upon it. But it did not happen that way. Ironically, the construction of the Barra Bonita Dam preserved the car almost perfectly. If it had remained in the river with its currents and seasonal changes, the remains would likely have been scattered or destroyed decades ago. But in the relatively calm, deep waters of the reservoir, protected by layers of sediment, the DKW became a macabre time capsule. Historical Vemag documents confirmed at least 5 other fatal accidents in 1954 and 1955 related to the same steering column defect in early DKW models. The company issued a quiet recall in 1956, but for Osvaldo, it was too late. He was already 6 meters deep on the bed of the Teat River. The story of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa is a brutal reminder of how fate can be sealed by mechanical failure, cruel timing, and circumstances impossible to foresee. There was no conspiracy, no crime, no dramatic escape or double life. Just a man driving home, probably thinking about the dinner awaiting him, the children he wanted to kiss goodnight, and a manufacturing defect that turned a familiar curve into his tomb. Today, the sky blue DKW-Vemag chassis 3241 is on display at the Jau Historical Museum. It has been restored only enough to stabilize the structure, but preserved with all the marks of time and tragedy. Visitors can see the steering wheel Osvaldo held for the last time, the seat where he sat, the pedals he pressed trying to brake a car that no longer responded. A plaque beside the vehicle tells his story, describing him as a father, husband, farmer, and above all, as a victim of impossible circumstances. There are no photos of him on the farm or with his family, as most were lost over the decades. But there is a portrait of him from 1953 when he obtained his driver's license. He looks at the camera with a serious, almost solemn expression, but there is a slight sparkle in his eyes, suggesting he was trying not to smile. Osvaldo Jr. died in 2024, just a year after the car's discovery at 76. Friends said he finally seemed at peace in the last months of his life. He had carried the question, "What happened to my father?" for 69 years, and finally had the answer. Helena still lives in Campinas, and at 74, she regularly visits her father's grave. Santa Eulalia farm no longer exists as Osvaldo knew it. The land was subdivided, sold, and transformed into modern sugarcane plantations with automated machinery. The main house was demolished in 2005 to make way for a storage warehouse. Yet, the oldest residents of Jau still remember the property, and some swear that on silent nights, they can still hear the distant hum of a 2-stroke engine echoing through the region. The case raised important questions about unresolved disappearances in Brazil. According to the São Paulo Civil Police, there are currently over 5 1,000 missing person cases in the state, some dating back decades. How many of these stories end like Osvaldo's? How many families spend generations without answers, building elaborate theories, when the truth can be as simple and tragic as a mechanical failure? The discovery also reignited interest in other historical disappearances in the Jiao region. Police archives were reopened, families who had given up hope were contacted, and some long-forgotten cases began to see new attention as the story of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa reminded everyone that the line between life and mystery can be as fragile as a steering column. For a long time, people kept asking questions. In 2024, 2 more vintage vehicles were found submerged in different parts of the Barra Bonita reservoir, though neither contained human remains. Dr. Eduardo Pacheco, a psychologist specializing in grief and family trauma at the University of São Paulo, studied the Ferreira da Costa family case. He observed that the absence of a body and the lack of certainty creates a unique type of suffering called ambiguous loss. Carmela spent 38 years not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead, whether she should wait for him or let him go. Osvaldo Jr. and Helena grew up with a void that could never be filled because it had no defined shape. When they finally received answers in 2023, relief came mixed with renewed pain because they had to process the loss all over again. But this time with certainty, explained the specialist, Vemag, which had been absorbed by other companies over the years and eventually ceased operations, never publicly commented on the case. Legal documents show that the company was aware of the steering column issues as early as 1955, but communication with vehicle owners at the time was limited. There were no social networks, emails, or national vehicle tracking systems. Many DKW owners simply never learned of the defect until it was too late. Automotive engineers who studied the case speculate that if Osvaldo had swerved just half a meter to either side on that curve, he might have hit a tree or rolled into the roadside. Serious injuries probably, but he would have survived. Half a meter. The difference between going home, having dinner with his family, and disappearing for 69 years. It is unsettling to think that for nearly 7 decades, while Carmela kept the couple's bedroom untouched, while Osvaldo Jr. hired investigators and chased false leads, while Helena married and had children who would never meet their grandfather, Osvaldo lay just 18 kilometers from home, preserved in the dark depths of the reservoir, trapped in his sky blue DKW, as if time had stopped that August night in 1954. The city of Jiao has changed drastically since then. Its population, 30,000 in 1954, now exceeds 140,000. Dirt roads were paved. Modern buildings replaced colonial homes. Technology transformed every aspect of life, but Osvaldo's mystery remained frozen. A temporal anomaly finally resolved not through advanced police investigation, but by 3 amateur fishermen on an ordinary October day. The fishermen who found the car, Marcelo, Bruno, and Rafael, said in interviews that they were haunted by the discovery for weeks. You go down expecting to find fish, maybe some lost objects, and suddenly you're face to face with a tragedy from 70 years ago. It was like opening a portal to the past, Marcelo described. They received an honorary mention from the Jiao City Council for handling the discovery responsibly and respectfully. The Barra Bonita Reservoir covers an area of 324 square kilometers. It is a vast aquatic cemetery of lost stories. How many other secrets lie beneath its waters? How many families could finally find peace if these secrets were revealed? These questions haunt not only the local residents, but anyone who contemplates how many lives were interrupted, how many stories remained unfinished, how much suffering could have been avoided. What makes Osvaldo's case particularly cruel is its banality. It was not a serial killer, an elaborate conspiracy, or even a dramatic accident caused by recklessness or intoxication. It was simply a piece of metal that broke at the wrong time, in the wrong place. Finding meaning or a lesson in that is difficult, and perhaps that is exactly what makes the story so unsettling. Carmela took to her grave the belief that her husband had died under tragic circumstances, but she never knew how or where. In a 1987 interview, 5 years before her death, she said, "I made peace with the uncertainty. Osvaldo was a man of routine, of commitments, of obsessive punctuality. He would never have abandoned us voluntarily. So I chose to believe that something terrible happened, something beyond his control, and I chose to honor him by keeping everything he built running." And that is exactly what she did, managing the farm with a firm hand until the 1990s. Meteorological records from the night of August 23, 1954, were recovered from the National Institute of Meteorology archives. The temperature was 17 degrees Celsius at 7 p.m., relative humidity 72%. No rain, no fog, no adverse weather conditions could explain the accident. It was a perfectly ordinary night, which, in a way, makes it even more tragic. The speed of impact with the water was estimated by experts to be between 40 and 55 kilometers per hour. Not excessive. It was exactly the speed any prudent driver would use on that dirt road at that specific curve. Osvaldo was not speeding, he was not reckless, he was simply driving home, and the car betrayed him. Child psychology specialists who analyzed the case noted the devastating impact the disappearance had on Osvaldo Jr. and Helena. Children who lose a parent under clear circumstances, though deeply painful, can process grief in a relatively structured way. But when a parent simply disappears without a body, without explanation, without a farewell ritual, the child becomes trapped in a psychological limbo. Part of them continues to expect the father to appear at the door. It's a wound that never fully heals, explained Dr. Marina Soares, an expert in childhood trauma. Helena recounted in an emotional 2023 interview, "I was only 4 years old when he disappeared, but I remember that last kiss on my head. For years, every time I heard a car approaching, my heart would race, thinking it might be him. Even as an adult, even after rationally accepting that he was probably dead, a part of me deep down still hoped. Now, at last, I can stop hoping. It is painful, but also liberating." The family's lawyer, Dr. Enrique Matos Costa, who helped Osvaldo Jr. navigate the legal matters after the discovery, noted a curious aspect. Technically, Osvaldo was legally declared dead only in 1962, 8 years after his disappearance, following the legal procedures of the time. But his actual death occurred in 1954. For 8 years, he was dead in reality, but alive in the eyes of the law. And then, until 2023, he was legally dead, but technically missing in the understanding of his family. These layers of ambiguity make the grieving process immensely complicated, explained Dr. Matos Costa. At the Church of João, where Osvaldo's mother, Dona Amelia, had lit countless candles over the years, a special mass was held in November 2023 in memory, not only of Osvaldo, but of all those who disappeared without a trace. Father Antonio Carlos Ferreira spoke in his homily about how the lack of closure is one of the most painful experiences a family can endure. Faith teaches us to accept what we cannot control, but that does not make acceptance any less difficult, he said. One particularly moving detail discovered during the car analysis was a small tin toy in the glove compartment. It was a rusty, deteriorated little horse, yet still recognizable. Carmela confirmed through old photos that Osvaldo had bought the toy in João days before disappearing, intending it as a gift for Osvaldo Jr. The boy never received it, and the little horse remained trapped in the DKW's glove compartment for 69 years, waiting to be delivered. This detail humanized the tragedy even further. Osvaldo was not just a name in a police report or a missing person statistic. He was a father who bought cheap toys to make his son smile. He was a man probably thinking about the joy on his son's face when giving him that horse, and he never had the chance. The examination of the clothing revealed another poignant detail. The brown wool coat Osvaldo wore was partially preserved, and inside the pocket, investigators found a small piece of paper, a handwritten shopping list in Carmela's careful script. It included everyday items: sugar, coffee, soap, kerosene for the lamps. At the bottom, she had written, "Don't forget to come back early. I'll make your favorite dish." This note, partially protected from the water by his leather wallet, was given to Helena, who framed it in a special display at her home. "It is the last communication between my parents," she said with tears in her eyes. "My mother asking him to come back early, and he never did. But now I know it wasn't because he didn't want to. It was because he couldn't." The impact of the discovery reached far beyond João and São Paulo. The case gained national attention, featuring in multiple television programs and documentaries. Osvaldo's story resonated with thousands of Brazilians who also had missing relatives. Support groups for families of the disappeared used the case to push for more resources for searches in water bodies and remote areas. In 2024, the São Paulo government announced the creation of a special task force dedicated to investigating long unsolved disappearances, equipped with modern sonar technology and professional diving teams. The program was informally nicknamed Operation Osvaldo by some staff, though its official name was different. By the end of 2024, the task force had recovered human remains in 7 cold cases dating back to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But perhaps the most important legacy of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa's case is not the changes in public policy or media attention. Perhaps it is the brutal reminder that we live in a world where the difference between returning home and disappearing forever can be a single faulty screw, a single moment of luck, or misfortune, a single curve in the road. Osvaldo was not special because he was famous or powerful. He was special in the way every human being is, a unique constellation of memories, hopes, relationships, and meaning. He was the center of Carmela's universe, the hero of Osvaldo Jr. and Helena, the respected employer of his workers, the beloved son of Bernardino and Amelia, and in a fraction of a second, because of a manufacturing defect he could neither know nor control, all of it was taken. The last time Osvaldo saw the sky was probably in those final seconds before the DKW sank completely. The August sky, perhaps with a few stars beginning to appear, tree canopies leaning over the river, and then darkness and cold water. It is an image that haunts anyone who contemplates the case deeply. Today, when driving through the João region along the modern paved road that passes near where the old dirt road once ran, there is no memorial, no sign marking the spot where Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa drove for the last time. The waters of the reservoir shine peacefully under the sun. Fishing and leisure boats cross the surface, and life continues as it always has. But now you know the story. You know that beneath the water, for nearly 70 years, lay a sky-blue DKW with a man who only wanted to come home. You know that every unresolved disappearance represents not only a lost person, but a destroyed family, unanswered questions, and a void stretching across generations. The case reminds us that mystery does not always mean conspiracy. Sometimes the explanation is devastatingly simple. A man, a car, a mechanical failure, and the cruel indifference of chance. There is no moral satisfaction in it. No villain to blame, no justice to be served. just the cold, relentless reality that tragedies happen, families suffer, and decades can pass before the truth finally emerges from the depths. Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa finally returned home in October 2023, 69 years, 1 month, and 21 days after leaving the gate of Fazenda Santa Eulalia. He did not return in the way Carmela had hoped, not in time to see his children grow, not in time to meet his grandchildren. But he returned, and perhaps, just perhaps, that means something for those who waited so long. After the discovery of the DKW-Vemag in October 2023, the story of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa captured the hearts and minds of people far beyond Jao. Helena, now in her mid-70s, made it a personal mission to honor her father's memory. She visited the cemetery regularly, placing fresh flowers, and sometimes sitting quietly for hours, reflecting on the strange, cruel twists of fate that had kept him hidden for nearly 7 decades. The museum in Jao, which displayed the restored DKW, became a quiet pilgrimage site for locals and history enthusiasts. Visitors were struck not only by the car itself, but by the story it carried, a reminder of how fragile life can be and how ordinary events can have extraordinary consequences. School groups were brought to the museum to learn about local history, civic responsibility, and the importance of remembering those lost. In the years following the discovery, Osvaldo's case prompted broader discussions about missing persons in Brazil. Authorities began re-evaluating decades-old disappearances, inspired by the idea that modern technology, sonar, underwater drones, and DNA analysis could finally bring closure to families who had waited generations for answers. The Operation Osvaldo task force continued its work, finding remains and vehicles in remote areas, giving families long-awaited peace. For the Ferreira da Costa family, the discovery offered a bittersweet closure. Osvaldo Jr., though he had passed away shortly after the car was recovered, had finally experienced a sense of resolution. Helena found solace in knowing that her father had not abandoned them, that he had been trying to return home, and that fate had simply intervened in the cruelest of ways. She often shared the story with her grandchildren, emphasizing the lessons it held about patience, memory, and the unpredictable nature of life. The tale of the DKW-Vemag became part of Jao's cultural memory. Local journalists wrote retrospectives, filmmakers discussed documentary projects, and historians cited the case as an example of how ordinary tragedies can ripple across decades. In every recounting, there was a focus not on blame or scandal, but on humanity, the love of a father for his children, the steadfast hope of a mother, and the resilience of a family who never gave up, even when the world seemed to have forgotten them. In the end, Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa's story was a reminder that some mysteries are not the result of crime or malice, but of circumstance, chance, and human frailty. It was a story that began with disappearance, lingered in uncertainty for decades, and concluded not with vengeance or revelation, but with the quiet dignity of truth finally emerging from the depths. The discovery of Osvaldo's DKW-Vemag also sparked a wave of reflection among the people of Jao. For decades, the story of the missing farmer had faded into local legend, a mixture of fear, speculation, and sorrow. Now, with tangible evidence, the community could finally confront the reality of what had happened. Local schools incorporated the story into history lessons, teaching students not only about the era of Brazil in the 1950s, but also about the fragility of life, the impact of mechanical failures, and the enduring power of family memory. For Osvaldo Jr. and Helena, the months following the discovery were emotionally intense. They sifted through the personal effects recovered from the DKW-Vemag, the wallet, the driver's license, the handwritten shopping list from Carmela, and even the small toy horse intended for Osvaldo Jr. Each item was a bridge to the past, a frozen moment in time that revealed the care and love their father had carried with him. Even in the moments leading up to the accident, the siblings held long conversations, sometimes crying together, sometimes silently sharing memories of the father they had once hoped would return. The forensic and mechanical findings also brought relief to many lingering questions. Experts confirmed that the accident was entirely preventable in theory, but unavoidable in practice, given the circumstances. There had been no foul play, no sinister plot, no hidden enemies, just the cruel intersection of a mechanical flaw and fate. For investigators and engineers, it became a case study in the importance of vigilance and safety, while for the family, it was a bittersweet reassurance that Osvaldo's disappearance was not the result of human malice. At the Barra Bonita Dam, the DKW-Vemag became a quiet monument. Visitors would stand in front of the vehicle, peering through the glass to see where Osvaldo had sat, where his hands had gripped the steering wheel, and imagine the final moments of a life that had been ordinary in every way yet ended so tragically. Museum guides shared the story not only of the man and his family, but also of the broader implications, how technology, luck, and circumstance could intertwine to alter lives in ways no one could predict. Meanwhile, journalists and filmmakers saw in Osvaldo's story a narrative that transcended time. Documentaries highlighted the human side of the tragedy, focusing on Carmela's decades of uncertainty, the children growing up without a father, and the eventual closure that came nearly 7 decades later. Social media amplified the story, connecting descendants of other missing persons with new hope and the realization that sometimes even the coldest mysteries can be solved, no matter how long it takes. Osvaldo's story became a symbol of patience, of enduring love, and of the quiet power of truth. It reminded everyone that while loss can stretch across decades, closure, when it arrives, carries profound significance. The town of Jiao, forever changed by the event, continues to honor his memory, not with grand monuments or statues, but with the understanding that every life, no matter how ordinary it may seem, leaves traces that can ripple through generations. The story of Osvaldo also left a lasting impression on the local community. Many of the older residents of Jiao recalled hearing about his disappearance as children, and for decades it had been a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, a reminder of how quickly life could change and how easily tragedy could strike without warning. When the news of the DKW-Vemag's recovery broke in 2023, these memories resurfaced, blending nostalgia with sorrow. For historians and journalists, the case became a rare window into life in mid-20th century São Paulo's interior. They explored the daily routines of farmers like Osvaldo, the rhythms of small towns, and the social fabric that defined communities like Jiao in the 1950s. The story illustrated not only the personal tragedy, but also the era, a time when a man's word was his bond, punctuality was sacred, and life moved at a measured pace that could still be abruptly upended by a mechanical failure. Psychologists and grief counselors cited the case in seminars about long-term ambiguous loss. Carmela's 38-year wait without closure and the decades-long uncertainty that shaped Osvaldo Jr. and Helena's childhoods exemplified how the absence of answers can alter an entire family dynamic. Dr. Eduardo Pacheco explained that families in similar situations often develop coping mechanisms based on hope and routine, holding on to fragments of normality while the mind struggles to reconcile the unknown. The eventual discovery, while painful, offered a sense of finality that years of speculation never could. The DKW-Vemag itself became an educational tool. Automotive experts analyzed its construction, particularly the steering column defect that had led to the fatal accident. Students of engineering and mechanics visited the museum to study firsthand how a seemingly small flaw could have irreversible consequences. It served as a solemn reminder that safety in design is not just technical, it can be a matter of life and death. Meanwhile, the Ferreira da Costa legacy lived on. Helena, though aging, dedicated herself to preserving her family's history, ensuring that the story of her father's life, disappearance, and ultimate recovery would not be forgotten. She worked with local archivists to digitize old photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings. For her, the story was not just about tragedy. It was about remembering a man who loved deeply, worked diligently, and whose life, though cut short, shaped the lives of everyone he touched. In Jiao, the river, the represa, and the old roads became more than just landmarks. They were reminders of how closely life and memory are intertwined. The tale of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa is now part of the town's identity, a story of loss, patience, and the eventual triumph of truth, no matter how long it takes to surface. In the years following the discovery, the story of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa became more than a historical curiosity. It became a lesson in the fragility of life and the endurance of memory. The town of Jiao, now a bustling city far removed from the quiet streets Osvaldo once knew, still carried whispers of the past. Elderly residents recalled the old dirt roads, the eucalyptus trees lining the river, and the day-to-day life of a man who had seemed larger than life in their memories. For Osvaldo Jr. and Helena, the closure brought a mixture of relief, grief, and reflection. They had spent almost 7 decades wondering, hoping, and sometimes doubting. Now, with the evidence recovered from the DKW-Vemag and the confirmation of their father's fate, they could finally process the full story. The small artifacts, the wallet, the toy horse, the handwritten note, served as bridges to the past, connecting them to the man they had lost before truly knowing him. The case also reverberated through Brazil, shining a light on unresolved disappearances. Families of missing persons saw in Osvaldo's story a reason to keep searching, to hold on to hope, and to insist that no case, however old, should be forgotten. The São Paulo government's special task force, nicknamed Operation Osvaldo, continued to locate and identify long-lost victims, providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. At the Museu Histórico de Jiao, visitors continue to stand before the restored DKW-Vemag, gazing at the steering wheel where Osvaldo's hands had last gripped, imagining the tragic moments of that August night in 1954. It is a solemn reminder that life is fragile, that the smallest mechanical failure can change everything, and that the impact of loss stretches far beyond the immediate moment. The legacy of Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa is neither grandiose nor sensational. There is no crime, no conspiracy, no dramatic escape. There was simply a man driving home to his family whose fate was sealed by a flaw he could neither predict nor prevent. And yet in that simple human story lies a universal truth. Life is precious, time is fleeting, and the love we carry for our families endures even across decades of uncertainty. In October 2023, when Osvaldo finally returned home, it was not in the way anyone had hoped. He did not walk through the doors of the Santa Eulalia farmhouse to greet his wife or hold his children. He did not see his grandchildren or the world he had left behind. But in the quiet, cold depths of the Barra Bonita reservoir, he waited, preserved by circumstance and sediment, until the truth could finally surface. And in that moment, families everywhere were reminded of something profound. Sometimes the answers are not mysterious, not conspiratorial, not dramatic. Sometimes they are heartbreakingly simple. A man, a car, a mechanical failure, and the cruel unfolding of fate. Yet, even in that simplicity, there is meaning, in the love preserved, in the questions finally answered, and in the generations who can finally at last know the truth. Osvaldo Ferreira da Costa's story is not just a historical account. It is a meditation on time, loss, and the human heart. It teaches that closure, no matter how delayed, is a gift, and that sometimes the most ordinary life can leave the most extraordinary mark.